All right, so we are recording. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Kafer. I am currently the Vice President of Quatrefoil Library. I use he, him pronouns, by the way. Quatrefoil Library, in case you aren't familiar or are new, welcome. We are a community center in Minneapolis that cultivates the free exchange of ideas and makes accessible LGBTQ materials for education and inspiration. And we are really excited and delighted about this event tonight. Hopefully it will be educational and inspirational. So it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Elias. Chris Elias is an assistant professor of history at the American University in Cairo. His scholarship and study focuses on questions of American identity, gender, sexuality. His writing has appeared all over the place in places like Aeon Psych, Airmail, Slate, Film Criticism, and more. And we are very excited for him to be here talking to us about his first book, which is Gossip Men. And so at this point, Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Paul, thanks so much for the introduction. And Claude and everybody else at the Quatrefoil, thank you so much for setting this up. I'm sad we can't be in person, but I'm still just really excited to be with all of you. I'm going to share my screen and it's host disabled participant screen sharing. So Paul or Claude, if you could hook me up there, that would be wonderful.
All right, sorry about that. Try it now.
Yeah, we're good to go.
Cool.
And I'll share this. I get this all set up. Yeah, again, thank you so much for setting this up. Those of you who are in Minneapolis, the Quatrefoil is just this fantastic community space that has kept going and stayed very vibrant throughout the pandemic. And when they're back up and running in person, they do great different readings and book groups and game nights and things like that. So please keep them in mind in the future. So this evening's talk is drawn from the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start giving you an overview of the book's argument, what brought me to the topic, my goals for the book, a little bit about my argument, and then given that this is for the Quatrefoil, I thought what I would do is focus a little bit on the book's examination of the way homophobia and homosexuality were portrayed in gossip magazines, largely during the 1950s, but I'll go back to the end of the 19th century to give us some context. Before I begin, I know we're all thinking it, so I'll come up and say it. This makes a perfect Valentine's Day gift for you and all your friends. You don't even have to include a card. You can just wrap this book in brown paper and give it to your sweetheart. And I think it probably just says everything you want to say about your romance. A book about three of the most horrific men of the 20th century. So you're welcome in advance. What I do as a historian is I like to work with something called microhistories. And that is taking an event that is small and contained and sometimes seemingly unimportant or overlooked and blowing it up, right? Talking about that event and then diving into it in such a way that reveals other things that are happening socially, other things that are happening politically, intellectually, all of that. And so this book begins, and I'll give you just a recounting of it, with a moment during the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. And the Army McCarthy hearings came about because of a supposed relationship between two guys. Roy Cohn, one of my main characters, and a gentleman by the name of G. David Shine, and I'll show you a picture of Shine in a minute. The hearings were a really, really big deal. They were the most watched live television event to that point in television's history in the United States. You can see how crowded this room was with television camcorders during the hearings. If you didn't have a TV at home, because many people didn't, you could go to a local department store. And so this is an image of a bunch of gentlemen watching the hearings at Gimbel's department store in downtown Milwaukee in April 1954. ABC and another group called Dumont, another channel, carried gavel to gavel coverage. CBS and NBC would run highlights every single night for the nearly month that the hearings were going on. I love this image of this young mother feeding her baby while watching the hearings on television. And then you can see her marriage photo, her wedding photo on top, and those like fantastic curtains that I'm sure are back in style right now with Gen Z people. So here's Joe McCarthy, he of the Army McCarthy hearings. There is Roy Cohn. Cohn, when you see him, he always has the scar on the front of his nose. And the reason is because his mother, one of my favorite stories about Cohn, when he was about 2 years old, his mother thought his nose was ugly. So literally there was a mother who looked at her baby and said, ugh, and decided to take him to a plastic surgeon in Manhattan. And the plastic surgeon screwed up the operation. So that's why Cohn had that scar on his nose. And here is the bombshell, G. David Schein. He was the son of a family that owned the Schein hotel chain. He went to Harvard, even though he didn't go to any classes. He actually sent a secretary in his stead to most classes. And right when he got to Harvard, he was hired by the McCarthy Committee because he had maybe written a pamphlet about communism. He was an unpaid volunteer, but in actuality, he had no idea about communism. And a number of theories go that McCarthy and Cohn wanted access to hanging out at Schein hotels for free, and they met at a lot of Schein hotels during their time together. The other persistent rumor, which my book kind of takes off on, is that Cohn either had a sexual relationship with Schein or had this unrequited love for him. When Schein was drafted into the Army in 1953, both Cohn and McCarthy went ballistic because they felt the Army was coming after them as a result of the investigations that they were in turn running into communists and homosexuals in the United States government. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But suffice to say, this set up a knockdown, drag out, heavyweight battle between the Army and McCarthy. And the two principals really were McCarthy himself. I love this image from Time magazine in 1953 with all of the insinuating language on the newspaper behind him. And all I also love it for the Chion that says Florida, the Playboy state grows up. And if like 1953 could see what Florida is right now, I'm sure they would want to run a correction on that article. But the other principal here was a gentleman by the name of Joe Welch. He was a lawyer from Boston, very avuncular or even grandfatherly. He was hired by the United States government, the United States Army, to come in and represent them in this argument between them and McCarthy. And he actually did so well. He was so telegenic that he had a minor film career afterwards. He starred opposite Jimmy Stewart in Anatomy of a Murder. Was Jimmy Stewart or Gregory Peck? I can't remember. So Welch is very telegenic. He ends up becoming pretty loved by many Americans who pay attention to the Army McCarthy hearings. He's seen as kind of the hero coming out of it. And on one day, the moment that really kind of inspired me to investigate the book actually comes when McCarthy has tried to introduce into evidence a doctored photograph, right? And why the photograph was evidence is not really of any importance. There's Welch holding the doctored photograph. You can see in his hand the cropped version on the desk there. And Welch is trying to figure out where this came from, right? And basically everybody in the hearing room knows that Roy Cohn is behind this. This has Roy's fingerprints all over it. And so when Welch is asked questions of another McCarthy staffer, he kind of starts asking rhetorical questions about where the heck did this photograph come from? And so this is the exchange that inspired me to write the book. Welch says to the staffer, well, did you think this photograph I hold in my hand comes from a pixie? Where do you think this picture I hold in my hand comes from? And Senator McCarthy, trying to jump in and defend his staff, says, will counsel for my benefit define, I think you might be an expert on that, what a pixie is. Welch comes right back and doubles down on the kind of homophobic, homosexual vernacular. I should say, Mr. Senator, that a pixie is a close relative of a fairy. Shall I proceed, sir? Have I enlightened you? McCarthy comes back and tries to parry this a little bit, but he's not really heard because the entire room has burst into laughter. And the laughter there at this joke is kind of what got me. When I watched video of this moment, I stopped to think, okay, why are they laughing, right? How do people sitting in a Senate hearing room in 1954 know what a pixie is, know what a fairy is, know that this is a double entendre, right? And I say this specifically because we're only about, I think, 14 months removed from the I Love Lucy episode where Lucille Ball was very clearly pregnant, and they talk about that she is pregnant on the episode that's aired in December 1952, but they can't use the word pregnant or pregnancy. They have to say, oh, there's a bundle of joy coming. Oh, she's really excited about things that are going to happen in about 9 months. All of this stuff, right? And so in this very cloistered and controlled cultural environment, do people know what they're talking about? Does my grandmother sitting in Winthrop, Massachusetts, watching on television in 1954, a couple months pregnant with my mom, who I just sold out her age, I guess, I'm sorry. Does my grandmother know about this? Do my grandparents know about this? And so this brought up a number of questions for me. Would most American TV viewers have picked up on the homophobic innuendo? And if so, how would they know terms like pixie and fairy? How did audiences learn about these rumors, if they do know about the rumors concerning Cohn, Schein, and McCarthy? And then the other bigger question is, this is a moment that's supposed to be about the national security of the United States. The investigations, of course, are around finding communists in the American government and trying to root out anti-communist or communist infiltration into the United States government. Why at this moment is this homophobic masculinist jousting intruding on the hearings, right? And then finally, how does this moment change our understanding of the Army McCarthy hearings? How does it help us understand the development of American political identity? The moment that we're taught in high school, in your US history class, junior year of high school, if you're at American high school, is the Joe Welch saying to Joe McCarthy, having no sense of decency, right? And the good guy wins by showing that Americans don't act this way together. Why are you not decent? And truth, justice, and the American way triumphs, right? But what happens to American political identity when you look at it through not the having no sense of decency moment, but rather this pixie fairy exchange? And so that's what kind of inspired me to go on the journey of writing this book. I thought that there was a lot more going on in the Army McCarthy hearings than was being told us in the histories that have been written and being really told to the American public. And for maybe the only time in our lives, Roy Cohn and I agreed on something. Cohn famously said about the Army McCarthy hearings that it had nothing to do with what it said it was doing. The hearings had nothing to do with what they said they were doing. Okay, so then where did I go from here? Well, in the book, what I try to do is work through a number of themes and historical contexts in order to answer those questions that I just outlined for you in the previous slide. And so some of the themes that I look at are obviously anti-communism during the Second Red Scare, this era of anti-communist anxiety, fervor, insanity, if you will, that extended from 1945 into the 1960s. And beyond, depending if you're a Reagan Republican. This advent of public relations and the birth of the modern political celebrity. Part of what I argue is that all three of my men, J. Edgar Hoover, Joe McCarthy, and Roy Cohn, I can't believe I just called them my men. I don't really want to explain to them, but here we are. But all three of my subjects use gossip in a positive way, use gossip about themselves to fuel stories about themselves in the newspapers that would help them with their professional and personal goals. For example, Roy Cohn very famously was always telling gossip columnists for the New York Post and other August publications that his engagement to Barbara Walters was right around the corner, right? And how did that help him kind of fend off accusations of homosexuality? The growth of the national surveillance state, right? What do we know about our fellow Americans? What do we know about our fellow citizens? And how does that knowledge change underneath this anti-communist fervor, underneath this era of anxiety, right? If you know that your neighbor down the street when she was in college was part of a socialist club, it might be interesting cocktail party chatter because now she is married to somebody who's an international banker or something like that. But all of a sudden, if that information becomes much more relevant in the context of that gossip becomes much more relevant in the context of the Cold War. The other things that I was interested in here were the history of masculinity, specifically masculine political identities, how those developed, the history of sexuality more generally, the history of not only how homosexuality is defined and talked about, but also how white heterosexuality is defined and talked about, and why heterosexuality is seen as such an essential element of American political identity. And then finally, where this path led me was that the conversations that I was most interested in, these conversations about what it was to be a homosexual in 1954 America, these conversations where outing was happening, even though the concept of outing, that nomenclature didn't exist yet, was happening, yes, in the columns of columnists in this kind of read between the lines language, but was happening much more explicitly in gossip magazines. And so that is the heart of the work that I'm doing in this piece, is looking at gossip magazines and trying to parse through where this conversation about homosexuality was happening in this incredibly buttoned up, cloistered culture in the United States of the 1950s. And so that's where I really want to turn right now, and to zoom into the work that I did specifically on gossip magazines and homophobia. And why this is so important to the argument is Cohn, McCarthy, and Hoover had a number of things in common. They were, even though they were people who came to power, they were all outsiders to some degree. Hoover was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up kind of upper middle class, but really broken into the Eastern establishment in the way that somebody like a Kennedy would have in that era. There are also persistent rumors. One of Vidal's favorite rumors that he talks about in a number of documentaries and interviews is that the Hoover family actually had African-American blood in it, and as such was kind of seen as outside because of that. Joe McCarthy was not from the East Coast at all and was Catholic. That marked him as an outsider. Roy Cohn, even though his father was a powerful Democratic judge in the Bronx, Roy Cohn himself was Jewish. So these were men who all couldn't really break into the upper echelons at a time that American culture and American politics were dominated by WASPs. The other thing that they have in common, in addition to their stringent anti-communism, they're playing fast and loose with the law, even while all three of them were lawyers trying to enforce the law, supposedly, is that all three of them had rumors about their sexuality that circulated during their lifetimes and affected the way that they approached their public image as they were trying to advance their personal and professional goals, right? Some of these rumors would turn out to be absolutely accurate. Roy Cohn, we would think of in contemporary nomenclature as homosexual, was probably started having sex with other men around the age of 16. when he was at the Horace Mann School in New York and then at Columbia University. Ended up very famously, Claude and I were talking about Angels in America earlier, ended up dying of AIDS in 1986, even though to the day he died, he said that he had liver cancer, which of course he knew was a lie because he is at the same time denying he has AIDS. He's pulling every possible string to get into AZT clinical trials. And this is probably, one of the reasons why I see him as, Claude asked me which one do I see as the most dastardly of the three, and to me it's Cohn. J. Edgar Hoover had persistent rumors that I'm sure we'll talk about later, but not only his sexuality, his relationship with his number two at the FBI, a guy by the name of Clyde Tolson, later stories about Hoover cross-dressing that we can discuss if anyone has interest. And then McCarthy himself, even though he had consciously portrayed himself as this rough and tumble, blue-collar, muscular, masculine boxer who works on the farm, won awards in the military during World War II. He himself faced rumors about his own sexual preferences and his confirmed bachelorhood. He was a bachelor until 1953. He finally married his secretary that year. So that's one of the things that all three of these men have in common is these rumors about their sexuality and how they had to counter them. But in understanding and trying to parse questions about these rumors of their sexuality, as I said earlier, I went and looked at where these conversations about sexuality were happening, frankly, in American culture for the first half of the 20th century. And I very soon happened upon that one of the few places they were happening was gossip magazines. And so what I want to do over the next few minutes before we get into my favorite part of these presentations, which is the question and answer session, is give you just a background on some of the gossip magazines I looked at and the way they talked about homosexuality. One of the earliest gossip magazines in American history is just one called Town Topics, the Journal of Society. It was popular in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century. This cover, which is the earliest one I could find quickly, is from 1919. What made Town Topics so popular was this feature that it had on the right, which is saunterings. It's almost a little bit like New Yorker magazines, like About Town section. It was these short clips, one paragraph, telling you about gossip from New York, Manhattan, high society. And many of those pieces of gossip were placed because the owners of Town Topics were interested in blackmailing the people who were subject to the pieces of gossip. So they would learn this piece of gossip, true or not, and go to a Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or a lower level Manhattan captain of industry and say to him or her, well, if you don't give us a certain amount of money or place a very expensive ad in our magazine, we're going to run this piece. Topics also invented the blind item that we're all familiar with in gossip magazines today, but they had this very interesting way of doing the blind item. And you would open the magazine as a folio, and the blind item, if it was on the left side of the page, on the left page as you read the magazine, on the right page, there would be another unrelated piece of news that would have the name of the person in the blind item in it. So if you just looked across the page, you could see, oh, this is probably about John Jacob Astor. Interesting. So it takes a little bit of the game of the blind item away, but tells you the information generally. The magazine was, ironically enough, brought down by Edwin Post, who was the husband of Emily Post, who would go on to be the etiquette expert when he set up a sting with the New York Police Department when Town Topics tried to blackmail him. Town Topics doesn't have too many instances of homosexuality and homophobia in its pages, and it's actually interesting the degree to which Town Topics is somewhat tolerant of what historians and genders call quote unquote non-normative sexuality for the moment. That would of course change with the gossip magazine that inherited the mantle of most popular gossip magazine in the United States after Town Topics came to its end. Broadway Brevities and Society Gossip. It's published in New York City from 1916 to 1925. It ended up closing and then moving to Toronto, New York, or Toronto, and then came back to New York over a number of years. But the classic moment was 16 to 25. They also made money from blackmail operations, but the most interesting part of Broadway Brevities was a series that they did called Nights in Fairyland. And what they would do is they would have a reporter go to a number of gay clubs in Manhattan and across New York. As those of you who have read George Chauncey's wonderful book, Gay New York, know, there isn't this kind of absolute lineage of a gradual societal coming out, if you were, as far as gay identity goes in the United States. There were moments before the 1950s, before World War II, where homosexuality was relatively in the open in certain areas of the United States, and the Lower East Side of Manhattan was one of them. So the Nights in Fairyland has this tour de force of homophobic sensationalism. There's at least 13 entries over a couple of years, and it's basically a guided tour for the readers of Broadway Brevities of gay hangouts in New York City during the late 20th century. And I'll just read you a quick quote here, quick quotes to give you an idea. This is from 1924. Fairydom has its quarters. In the Bowery, poor and shabby F-words of every breed may be seen. In the Bronx, F-words of Jewish descent. In Mulberry Street, inverts Italiano. In Chinatown, the comical Oriental earning. Not less may be observed in the colored neighborhood of Lenox Avenue, or on that long reach of from 110th Street to 160th, hordes of, quote, big boys flamboyantly arrayed, plying the oldest and most noxious of all trades, and so throughout the city, throughout the nation, throughout the world. Broadway Brevities is notable in addition to its blatant and kind of vulgar homophobia. It introduces a number of Americans to language that is kind of underground gay vernacular. So it introduced readers to words such as camp, fairy, punk, F-word, and invert. The majority of the coverage is about gay men, though there were some mentions of lesbianism in the pages. And this, I hate throwing blocks of text at you, but the pearl clutching and the ways in which gossip magazines talked about homosexuality as this disease and this problem running rampant is worth me putting up this block quote that I'll read to you. This is Broadway Brevities on the Homosexual Menace from the November 1924 issue of the magazine. What a dirty mess. Yet it's a hint of things present and things to come. Verily, in this year of our Lord, 1924, the question is, as a brilliant psychiatrist remarked to us the other day, not of who is, but of who isn't. Into the very warp and modern social fabric has eaten devastatingly this cancer of sexual inversion, wiping out manhood and womanhood, making a mockery of natural love, of normal behavior, wrecking homes and lives untold. The sickening of homosexuality is in the nostrils of all of us, and for all of us, its menace is stupendous. It is indeed the pestilence that stalks alike at noonday and night, enfeebling and degrading our civilization, making a byword of all that is clean and sweet and of good repute. If these articles, brevities, has been able to abate by one jot this epidemic of shameless lechery, then we feel our efforts have not been in vain. And to such noble purpose are dedicated the still more relentless exposures to come. And so this brings up the question, of course, why are magazines like Broadway Brevities and other gossip magazines dedicated to this homosexual or homophobic animosity, right? And I'll get into that answer in a moment, but gossip magazines, like a lot of modern American culture, I'll add, really thrive off of amping up their readership, right? They need, red meat for the base, as we would say in modern political lingo. And in some ways, this is red meat for the base. It gives people access to an area that they don't know about, perhaps, but it also gives them something to be morally anxious about and be angry. One of my favorite stories as far as media consumption is concerned actually goes back to Howard Stern in the 1980s or in the early 1990s when he was on the radio. A very famous study came out that people who liked to listen to the Howard Stern radio program listened for an average of, I think it was 12 minutes. People who hated Howard Stern, who didn't like Howard Stern, ended up listening for an average of 35 minutes, right? And so we consume things that are often not to our taste to some degree. We want to read about or hear about, in the case of Stern, bad things in the world, perhaps more than positive things in the world. The other thing I'll mention here, just because it's on my mind, is the recent movie Power of the Dog. It's getting a lot of play. No spoilers here, but there's a scene in there in which a character uncovers a series of physical culture magazines. The other place, and I haven't talked about this too much, but the other place where there was a homosexual print culture happening was in these physical culture weightlifting magazines for men like Eugene Sandow, German-American immigrant known as the perfect man, who would pose either naked or wearing just fig leaves over his genitalia in different kind of muscular poses, ostensibly to teach people how to lift weights and the proper construction of musculature. Now, these physical culture magazines were, of course, consumed by young men who were interested, who had sexual interest in other men, but they were able to get past the censorship, the ban on sending pornography through the US mail, because they were labeled as physical culture magazines, weightlifting magazines, and not male pornography, or what we think of today as softcore pornography, right? And so there is this very interesting friction, narrative, whatever word I'm looking for here, in which at the same time, I'll come to this at the end of the presentation, at the same time, you have this kind of rampant homophobia in these magazines. You also have magazines serving as a way to let certain Americans know, particularly Americans who don't have access to the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1910, that there are other people like them out there, which is, I think, one of the few silver linings you can draw or pull out of this homophobic narrative that is so present in these magazines. Jumping ahead, gossip magazines, for various reasons, kind of go down for the 30s and 40s. One of those reasons, interestingly enough, is paper rationing, but they hit a boom and hit perhaps the greatest stride in the 1950s. And that's where I want to spend the rest of the time. There are wonderful titles for these magazines. You can see here, Top Secret, Hush Hush, Suppressed, On the QT is another one that I love. But the king of the gossip magazines in the 1950s was Confidential, which is actually also getting play in another popular movie right now, Being the Ricardos, has a moment in which a story in Confidential causes upset in Ricky and Lucy's marriage. Confidential came out, their inaugural issue was in December 1952. What made Confidential different from other magazines was a couple of things, but perhaps the most important was that they were willing to talk about gossip about politicians, right? And they were also willing to print things that other magazines seemed not inclined to do, particularly explicit stories. And so the Confidential ends up being, for this kind of 3 to 5 year period in the early 1950s, from 1952 to 1957, one of the most popular magazines in America. At the newsstand, it's outselling in certain months Look, the Saturday Evening Post, and Time magazine. And the other thing about Confidential, it's a little bit like today's Us Weekly. Every single physical copy of Confidential is read usually by 3 to 5 people. It's what in the business is called a high pass-through rate. So there is this idea that tons and tons of people are reading this magazine. And one of the things that Confidential is obsessed with printing stories about homosexuality. So I'm just going to take some time and go through a couple of the classic stories about homosexuality that Confidential did to give you a context of understanding where conversation or specific conversation was happening in mainline popular culture about homosexuality during the early 1950s. This is probably one of the most famous stories and has nothing to do with homosexuality, but on the left you see this bit about Rory Calhoun's arrest. Rory Calhoun was a B-level actor, but Confidential got this story from Universal Pictures Studio because they were going to publish a story about Universal Pictures' biggest star, Rock Hudson, being gay. Universal Pictures freaks out and says, "We'll do anything, we'll give you a bunch of dirt on our other stars." Here, for example, Rory Calhoun was arrested for assault a number of years ago. Also got his unibrow here. You can see that his mugshot, this dolled up version. And so Confidential was getting this information about about stars kind of left and right and publishing it. A journal, and they were often publishing all kinds of gossip about stars, but they really were pioneers in what we would now in 21st century, late 20th century, 21st century terms call outing, right? They're obsessed with outing stars. One journalist commented that Confidential was, quote, queer for queers. During the 1950s, Confidential reported homosexual rumors about Ray, Tab Hunter, Van Johnson, Elizabeth Scott, Marlene Dietrich, Dan Daly, King of Sweden, the infamous bank robber Willie Sutton, Vanderbilt heir by the name of Peter Orton, and an entire gay dorm at Harvard University. They were constantly harping on this fear of homosexuality. This story about Adlai Stevenson, Democratic presidential candidate in 1952 and 1956, was notable because Confidential did not want to get sued for libel. So the rumor, how that Stevenson rumor is that Stevenson is having sexual relationships with other men, that Stevenson, the entire article never says that he is gay. It just says that it is a rumor that questions the validity of his manhood. The grand irony, of course, is that Stevenson was an inveterate womanizer. One of my favorite stories in American political history is the fact when Stevenson died in the 1960s, no fewer than 4 of his mistresses met at his funeral. So the homosexual rumors in that case, not true. Other things that Confidential did was introduce readers to the story of trans individuals, most notably Christine Jorgensen, a former American GI who went to Denmark to have top and bottom surgery, as we would call it today, and became kind of a national sensation. So in addition to the homophobia, they were playing and interrupting or interacting with some transphobia. This is in this article, they have the line, they learned about the hijinks, the first dame ever stamped made in Copenhagen, where she had her surgery. More transphobia from Confidential here, talking with Victor Mature, a stage and screen actor of the 1950s, sleeping with a woman who was actually a man. Confidential's quote unquote investigative reporting here seen about the Mattachine Society in 1954 revealed for Americans that there was this whole homosexual underground. Confidential was, of course, doing it in a way to expose fear of this homosexual cabal coming for Americans, trying to attack and infect good American suburban homes. But it gave Americans an understanding of the presence of homosexual communities throughout the United States. It also gave Americans access to homophobic or lingo, vernacular, I should say, about homosexuality. I'll just read some of the words and terms that appeared in Confidential in the 1950s, just so you can trace some of these here. Confidential's articles on homosexuality exposed its readership to a small dictionary of terms, including lavender, fire, scared, lonesome, whimpering, double-gated, secret, abnormal, drag, daughter, gay, woman, Mary, and other female names for men, never married, confirmed bachelor, lifelong bachelor, and queer. Gay women and lesbianism were written about using terms of tomboy, going for dolls, both sides of the street, baritone babes, lesbian, strange girl, and never married. Lesbians were portrayed as women wearing men's clothing and adopting aggressive stances. And centrally, Confidential's use of that slang popularized its meaning for broad audiences, allowing readers to recognize them when they were used in conversation or in other publications. So the argument I'm making here is that even though we think of as American mainstream society, sitcoms running on ABC, NBC, things like that, were avoiding all talk. The New York Times, the New Yorker, Time, Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, they're avoiding all talk about homosexuality. Americans are exposed to a very prejudiced, very horrific and homophobic understanding of homosexuality through these gossip magazines. And so when the Army McCarthy hearings happen and when Roy Cohn is all but called a pixie and a fairy, they know, or at least the majority of Americans, or a good percentage of Americans, know what that language is referring to. These magazines, why was Confidential specifically so interested in stories about homosexuality? Well, number one, they seemed to sell magazines. The issues that had major articles about homosexuality seemed to sell very well for publisher Robert Harrison. The other thing that Confidential did is, if you look at the advertisements in so many gossip magazines today, as in yesterday, so many advertisements are based on anxiety about body, about your intelligence or lack thereof, about your achievement, about your social class, and Confidential is no different. It is filled with advertisements like this one, which was a correspondence course to learn a new success-winning He-Man voice. Are you man enough? Right away and find out. There was we can see another example of reliance in this masculine anxiety to sell. This is actually from the magazine On the QT. On the right side, a building program. On the left side, what can be described as a male girdle. Spank for Men, circa 1954. There is a consumer, but not perhaps penetrated in the 21st century if anyone's looking for business ideas out there. And then, of course, Charles Atlas, very famously a bodybuilder, promising to make you, quote, a new man in Confidential. Here's what I can do for you. I've made new men out of thousands of other fellows. All right, and so the piece de resistance here, in my argument in the book, where this kind of ends up for me is that a gossip magazine is where rumors about Joe McCarthy. Rave only published for about a year and a half, but it printed a number of articles about Joe McCarthy, reporting allegations that he was, quote, a secret homosexual, and just for fun, a secret communist as well. When we think about the importance of Confidential and homosexuality, homophobia specifically, in gossip magazines, I guess there's a question of like, why does this matter? Why do we care? And so I'll stop sharing and give you a couple of comments to close up on that question. One of the things is my argument about giving this homophobic vernacular argument to Americans at a time when they were not getting other cultural presentations or portrayals of homosexuals and gay communities in the United States, right? So into this vacuum rushes this very vulgar, prejudiced understanding of what it means to be gay in modern American society. That's one thing. The other thing is it helps fuel one of the most important aspects of the 1950s Red Scare that isn't talked about as often, but should be, and that is something called the Lavender Scare. David Johnson, who's a historian, has written a book called The Lavender Scare that posits that more people lost their jobs in the 1950s as a result of accusations of homosexuality than lost their jobs as a result of accusations of communism. And so this idea, homosexuals were a disease on the American body politic, right? Not only morally, but homosexuals working in important jobs in the government and in the United States Army were open to things like blackmail, and could be very easily turned in eyes for the Soviets, is part of the reason that this anti-homosexual, this homophobic panic that we now know as the Lavender Scare is fueled. But at the same time, I don't want to be totally a downer here, so I'll leave you with another idea, which is to read these sources kind of against the grain. And that is, yes, Confidential has, just like Broadway Brevities before it, this sharply prejudiced, homophobic series of articles that are coming out and coming into American homes and crossing American eyeballs. But in publicizing queer communities, even in this kind of homophobic language of fear, they're still communicating to queer Americans, particularly queer youth, that there are other people like them out there in the United States. I know I'm grasping for straws here. I know that I am perhaps seeing light where there is none. But at the same time, we have to consider the fact that when the Mattachine Society is founded in the 1950s, there is a gay pride march outside of the White House in 1960, right? Those communities would possibly not be possible if it weren't for these underground forms of communication that were happening. And I'm not saying, to be clear, that gossip magazines were a result of that. There are other forms of code switching, underground communication. Comics were very important at the time. Other publications, like One, was important. But it maybe in a very slight way contribute to the formation of homosexual communities that would eventually create the communities we have today. So I'll pause there or stop there. I'd love to talk about any questions you have about the book, about homophobia in the 1950s, about gossip magazines, about the movie The Power of the Dog, and whether it's any good, whatever you want. But thank you so much for being here.
The point that you made right at the end, Chris, was exactly the one that I had been formulating in my head when you showed those 1920s magazines. When they talk about, they talk about these gay bars in New York, and they talk about, yeah, it's very negative, but they use words like stupendous. And I was like, if I'm a young queer 20s, I'm like, I'm stupendous, let me go there. I want to go to that bar and be stupendous, even if I'm tawdry and I'm everything else. I want to go to that bar and I want to be with those other stupendous F-word people. I mean, really, the language was very, to me, inviting, despite the negatives. I mean, and I'm just going to read like every fifth word, and I'm going to get stupendous, blazing, whatever it is.
Right.
There's like 4 bars that are named. Okay, I'm going to go there next weekend. I just
right. And that line drawing of
go there.
Yeah. The line drawing of, I think, the sailor dancing on the table, that looks a lot of fun.
I know.
I'd love to go to that bar, right? Yeah. So no, yeah.
I don't think you are grasping at straws. I think it's a really brilliant way to turn from the one thing into the other thing, right? I do not think it's grasping at straws. I mean, as a queer person, I had that very strong reaction when you showed those, when you read that paragraph, I think it was from Town Topics, of like, sign me up. Next Saturday, that's where I want to be, Lewis's.
Right.
Or the one in Chinatown or whatever.
And speaking of those efforts, somebody, Last Call, I can't remember the name of the author right now. There's a book that was published this last year about the Last Call serial killer in New York, who during the late 1980s and early 1990s was targeting gay bars and ended up killing, I think, a half dozen young men. And what makes the book so brilliant is that it's not serial killer, and it's not about the murders, it's about the victims, and it's about the lives that they were able to create for themselves in the face of this kind of post-AIDS, gay cancer culture of 1980s New York. And so I hope that anytime we do a history of marginalized peoples, whether they're marginalized because of their sexuality, their immigration status, their race, fill in the blank, that we are conscious of trying to recover the narratives of good here, the narratives of perseverance and narratives of kind of triumph.
Yeah. I wonder, another thing that occurred to me, and having spent so much time in these early days with these three reprehensible figures, I mean, one of the things that gay lib was supposed to bring about was that a Roy Cohn, if not in the closet, a Joe McCarthy or a Edgar Hoover, if not in the closet, may not have been such a bad enemy of the gay person. I mean, have we progressed to the fact where we don't really seem to have the closeted homophobes of yore?
You'd like to think so, but man, who was the senator for a couple of years ago? And you seem to still have, I forget the name of the rule that is adopted by the Advocate and other mainline gay publications right now about outing, right? That they will out somebody if they are actively engaged in anti-gay legislation or anti-gay advocacy. And you know, Milk's call of out of it and onto the street has these multiple, yes, it's a call to political liberation. Yes, it is a call to telling people, and you know, yes, you have a gay neighbor, yes, you have a gay brother, yes, you have a gay sister, but it's also this idea of personal reformation and trying to avoid the kinds of issues that maybe would create a Roy Cohn. And I think we've gotten there to a degree, but you know, we certainly haven't gotten there all the way. So anywhere small enough group too that you just want to unmute or raise hands, that's great as well for questions.
There's a question in the chat. Shall I read it?
Yeah, please.
This is from Jim Seelar. I'm wondering if there was much cross-fertilization or co-marketing of the gossip magazines and the pulp novels of the 1950s that often featured quote-unquote scandalous depictions of queers. I wonder if there's much cross-fertilization.
Of course, Jim asks a brilliant question. I haven't thought about that because you do have the other place that obviously same-sex relationships would be portrayed at the time, or these pulp fiction novels, and it's a brilliant question. There is obviously a crossover in marketing too, right? Trying to sell. They're all in search of a dollar. But Jim, I'm kind of stumped, and I'm going to have to think that through and maybe talk about that with you offline at some point, because I think it's a really smart idea, but I don't know if they're actually officially ever working together, or if they're being published by the same publishing houses. So many of these gossip magazine publishing houses were also publishing the pulp fiction novels, the pulp novels. So I'm starting to think that maybe, yeah, you're right. There is some kind of, hey, this thing is working in gossip magazine. Let's put it in a 5-cent paperback. So, but yeah, it's smart. But let's think about that. Sue, I see your hand up.
Sue or Christine, you need to turn your mute off. You get your mute on. You hit the space bar, or just, yeah, there you go.
I did it. Okay, what I'm interested in is, I mean, many things, but where does this all fit in with like Hedda Hopper and Elsa Maxwell and all of the people who are doing gossip in very, very mainstream venues?
It's a great question. To my knowledge, Hopper is not talking about, you know, Hedda Hopper, Walter Winchell, other gossip columnists of the era. Hopper keeps it relatively light, and she's not, yes, she might bring some fight breakups. she's not doing it with the kind of sharp tone that Confidential is doing and some of the gossip magazines are doing. You go to the gossip magazines to kind of, if Hedda Hopper obliquely references something in the newspaper, if you want the real story, you're going to take out Confidential. Confidential's slogan for a while is tells the tales, names the names, right? I'm screwing that up. But tells the facts, names the names, right? And so if Hopper is being oblique about something, if Winchell's being oblique about something, then you can find out more in these gossip magazines because they're not limited by being part of this larger group of mainstream media companies. And I don't know, Sue, it's a wonderful question because I don't know if Hopper is, I don't have any evidence from what I have read that Hopper references any kind of queer themes in her writing. The other thing that makes Hopper different from Confidential is Hopper and Winchell are getting information because they are cultivating friendly sources at Paramount. They're buddies with all these people, and at MGM and at United Artists and all these other places, right? They're buddies with all these people. Confidential cultivates sources, busboys, prostitutes, cab drivers. They're getting the dirt from almost this underbelly rather than getting the PR releases. And I think that's possibly what divides them as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting. Chris, I wonder if you have, and I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet, but if in the book or in your research you uncovered evidence of a couple of things. A, did any of our trio of reprehensible humans that are on the cover of your book, A, did they plant stories in Confidential or other magazines about their supposed enemies, whether they be queer or commies? And B, did you have evidence of how they actually took the tactics of those magazines and used them in their own press materials or their own photographs? And I mean, what was their technique, would you say, in trying to undermine their enemies?
One of my favorite keystones here, like the kind of skeleton key that unlocked so many things, is that Joe McCarthy during the 1950 Senate campaign of an enemy by the name of Mallard Tidings in Maryland published his own gossip magazine to try to Tidings. And so McCarthy was intensely aware of the power of this kind of narrative. Another one of my favorite stories about McCarthy and Cohn knowing the power of the press and planting stories is they knew that most newspaper afternoon editions went to press around 3 p.m. So they would call a witness at 2 o'clock or 2:30, have the witness on the stand and come out and say, oh yeah, definitely I know that Claude Peck is a communist. I saw him at a communist meeting, he had Ray on, all this stuff, right? And then before that individual could be brought to terms and totally torn down during cross-examination, the newspaper's already gone to press.
Oh, okay.
And it's very Trumpian in the sense that the headline matters. Again, the Cohn-Trump connection we've been talking about a lot the last 5 years. The headline matters. The correction in 10-point font the next day that runs on page 57 or whatever doesn't matter as much. So that's how they control the narrative. The other thing I'd talk about is this kind of positive gossip where Hoover, McCarthy, are all engaged in trying to plant positive stories. Yes, in gossip magazines, they're more involved with political / gossip columnists, Winchell, George Sokolsky. Who else am I thinking of here? There's a number of gossip columnists. Originally, the Alsops are on, or Drew Pearson's on the McCarthy side. They have a huge falling out. But there is in Confidential a story that's likely planted by one of them that says there are communist assassins coming to the United States to kill J. Edgar Hoover, Joe McCarthy, and Bishop Fulton Sheen because they're just too successful at battling communism. And that, of course, is wonderful press for them. That 1953. I focused on this idea of gossip magazines tonight, but the book really gets into the ways in which Hoover is essential to being a trailblazer in using these kind of PR anting stories to create of himself that's positive in the American public.
Someone must have an additional question or two.
I'll ask a question.
There we go.
Hello. Hi, Paul. So I have kind of two sides of the same question. I was just kind of curious about what the legacy of this is. On the one side, kind of Joe McCarthy. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm like 4 miles from where he's buried right now. So my question is, fun fact. So as far as Joe McCarthy goes, it'll come up sometimes in kind of Wisconsin history. And a lot of what comes up is the anti-communism part, not the homophobia. So I'm just curious on, what is the majority of Joseph McCarthy's legacy, the anti-communism, or how widely is the homophobia known? And then, what's the equivalent today of gossip magazines? Like what's today's equivalent? Is it Blind Items? Is it People magazine? What does that look like today?
Yeah, two great questions. I'll take the second one first, and then go back and talk his legacy. I think it is the dark web necessarily is the kind of online portals, whether it be InfoWars or Red State or Town Hall, to perform some sense of objectivity. I'm also going to say, like, I don't know, maybe Mother Jones. I don't know. I don't know if I'll actually believe that. But the fact of the matter is that you have these online publications that have a similar reach in a very specific way, right? Because they're very targeted in our siloed media landscape. But they have a similar capacity to spread, whatever lie it may be, right? Whether it's, big lie stuff, 2020 election, QAnon bullshit, whatever the hell it is, right? So I think that's where it is. But then you still have some old media stuff. Remember, the Inquirer buys, is it the Snails or the Kelly story for what, $160,000 and buries it, right? The National Enquirer, I ended the book with this story. The National Enquirer was bought by a guy by the name of Genasario Pope. And for many years, nobody knows where Pope got the money to buy the National Enquirer in the late 1960s. He first tries to make it into really be a gossip magazine, and then in order to get on supermarket aisles, turns to being slightly more pulled back. But it was later revealed, and I think the best we know was, number one, Pope got half of his money to buy the National Enquirer from the mob, the Giancana mob. He got the other half of the money from Roy Cohn, which is incredible when you think of the degree to which you have this lineage with a stopover on Roger Stone into Donald Trump, right? So the National Enquirer helping Donald Trump get elected, the only endorses Trump in 2020. There's a legacy of Joe McCarthy is concerned. I mean, the guy's not doing great. His name is a noun referring to used both people on both the left and the right to refer to accusations without evidence and being a horrible person. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think about McCarthy is he may have fueled the anti-communist purges. He may have fueled a lot of this homophobia during the Lavender Scare. He famously once said, and excuse my language here, boys, you ain't got nothing to fear from me unless you're a communist or a cocksucker. And so he was always pairing these two things together. And there was so much work that was done about how close communists were to homosexuals. They meet in secret together. They have their own codes. They have their own groups. They have their own language, right? And so these two fears fueled each other. But I think the real damage that's done is not necessarily even Hollywood stuff or stuff a couple of years later. The people on who are being removed from teaching positions, school board positions, and people that we will never hear about, these thousands upon thousands, if not millions of people that lose their jobs. And so when I think of Joe McCarthy, I think of him as a Fed, and underneath him is all the stuff. And yes, homosexuality, anti-communism gets all the big print, but as I mentioned earlier, David Johnson shows, it's the Lavender Scare, it's the homophobia that really kind of takes out this generation of people. So, but yeah, wave it, say hi to Appleton, Wisconsin for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Arthur.
Okay. So it was, just want to say thanks. It was incredibly informative to me, at least, because it feels like this is one spot in history that I have personally tend to overlook as far as a grand scale of gay queer history. I guess one inquiry that's just nagging in the back of my head, and you can just let me know if it's detailed in your book. One thing I kind of noticed, first kind of pieced together myself, is that not only like there is this Lavender Scare, like instigated by McCarthyism, there is the Lavender Scare in Idaho in 55, and then there was the Peter Wildblood case over in the UK going on kind of simultaneously. I guess my question is, it kind of seemed like this didn't necessarily disappear, but somewhat tapered off a bit, like in the 60s, as you said. So I suppose when did you think that, as far as this wave of Lavender Scare is concerned, when did you think the end was nigh? Like, what specific point in this timeline?
Good. Because I think you have to think the Lavender Scare ends with some of the Frank Kameny Mattachine Society work that's being done in the later 1960s. They're obviously organizing before Stonewall, but having some very small, but I would say significant legislative victories around then. Shit, I don't know. If you're a queer teacher at a Catholic school right now, the Lavender Scare hasn't ended for you. And so I don't know if we can ever say this stuff ends or that it ever will. If you buy one book, Arthur, buy my book, please. But if you buy two books, there is this pretty good book that came out last year, got a ton of press, and was on a bunch of top 10 lists. It's called The Deviant's War. It's about Frank Kameny. It's really, really smart and detailed, and there's a lot of really good research in here. And it does, if my book is in some ways, what I like so much about what Eric Cervini does in here is my book is a lot of like doom and gloom and like look at these whole people because you construct around Frank Kameny and the Mattachine Society, giving us that I am not, and showing us the way that, yeah, all of this is going on, but you have people organizing, and you have the Daughters of Bilitis, and you have all these groups that are doing. So does it end? No, but you know, not to steal a trademark, but it gets better maybe.
I reckon, because like, just looking at that trajectory, I mean, after, you know, the Lavender Scare, we have Stonewall, and then we have Anita Bryant and her, crusade against them lovely gays and queers down in Florida. And then we had, the AIDS plague. Then we had, from what I can think of right off the top of my head, transphobia in the 90s with the Brandon Tina.
Right.
And then Matthew Shepard, like it does come in waves. It just seems to be a pattern. And it kind of seemed like, at least in history books, oh, there was McCarthyism, and then all of a sudden, poof, it's gone. So it would be interesting to delve deep and to be like, where were there signs of McCarthyism going out of style, so to speak? His brand of scare tactics and attacking the gay queer community at the time.
Right. No, and I think that's good. And the other question is that we can never measure is to what degree does, yes, the stuff we try to measure it in popular culture because that's the evidence we have and it's readily available. But, and again, I feel like I'm preaching here, but like, to what degree is it happening in the home? Like, to what degree is somebody actually saying this stuff to their children? Is it passed down in a living room in Appleton, Wisconsin, rather than in public? But yeah, great questions.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Have I been called on?
Do it. You have been now officially.
Well, I was just thinking about all the publicity photos that J. Edgar Hoover and his Clyde Tolson, they're always like the State Stork Club and, all of these different places and, like really getting their names in the paper. I mean, it's very much, sort of like, oh, here's, New Year's Eve and everybody's having a good time. Do you think, was that like deliberate so that if you just put it out there and have everybody wearing party hats, that you can, somehow then, I don't know, that the gossip that would say they're queer would be like, oh, well, they're not. I mean, here, I saw them, pictures of them celebrating. They're just kind of flamboyant and whatever. I don't know.
No, they're absolutely, that's a part of it. Absolutely, that's what Hoover is doing. Hoover, oh God, he put it in the newspapers. He's dating, is it Ginger Rogers' mother? I can't believe I can't remember this right now. But he was, yeah. And so I think it's Ginger Rogers. There's a title fight in Yankee Stadium in, I don't know, 38. Joe Louis is defending, and Tolson and Hoover always sit together. They sit in two different places in Yankee Stadium in the box so that they can talk to groups of reporters. They are always conscious about the narrative surrounding them. Hoover often would have young women come meet him at events so that newspaper reporters would be like, hey, who is that blonde that just came over and sashayed away? And so you're definitely right. They're totally onto this in the same way that Cohn is doing the same thing. And I talk about McCarthy's done the same thing, showing up with a different girl in his arm every time he goes out. McCarthy, it's more just because he's catting rather than trying to influence or go back against or push back against homosexuals. But you're absolutely 100% correct. They realize the power of the press to make their political points, as we were talking about earlier, Claude and I were talking about earlier, but maybe more importantly, they realize the power of the press to create a masculinist political identity that is going to amplify their power ultimately, right? Yeah, good point. All right, so Jim put a couple in the chat, so I'll read them real quick. Number one, I know Cohn was gay, although he denied it, and I assume the same was true of Hoover. Was there any biographical evidence that McCarthy was a closeted homosexual? And number two, how is Cohn's queerness addressed or not in these exchanges with or mentoring or Trump? Supposedly, according to a report from, I'm going to say Politico, but maybe it wasn't, Cohn came to visit Trump in 85 or 86 at Mar-a-Lago. God, why do I know the name of that place? At Mar-a-Lago. They have a dinner for Cohn there. Trump has been friends with Cohn forever. Supposedly in Cohn's office, there was a picture of the Donald hanging. It said, "To Roy, my greatest friend, Donald Trump." They are tight. They are really, really close, personally and professionally. Supposedly, Trump didn't decide to marry Marla Maples, until he asked Cohn's advice on whether it would be good for his career. Cohn comes to visit Trump at Mar-a-Lago in 1986. Trump later brags to people about fumigating all of the silverware to get rid of the AIDS on the thing. So Trump basically writes off Cohn the last year of his life in order to stay away from, the quote unquote gay cancer. And so
Nice.
if there's anything that made you feel bad for Roy Cohn, I don't know. And then Jim, that first question, so the Hoover thing is so fascinating because in the history of homosexuality, we're always talking about this. What does it mean to be gay at this moment, right? Was Hoover gay? I don't know. Was he asexual? I don't know. Was he something identity that we have today, but he wouldn't know himself? There's a lot of work that's done on specifically the cross-dressing story probably not being true. Even though we all want to believe it, and it's how we all remember him. When you sit down when you used to sit on subways and talk to somebody next to you on an airplane and say, "What are you working on?" I would say, "Oh, Edgar Hoover." They say, "Oh, the guy in the dress," which is some poetic justice that is how Hoover is remembered. But to some degree, no, about sexuality and this story, and I can't figure that out. So the more interesting thing is whether or not Hoover was gay, but why do people think he was gay and what was going to bring him down? And why is it that everybody remembers the story about the dress and not the stories about him wiretapping Martin Luther King and running COINTELPRO, right? On the question of McCarthy, there was a number of stories of McCarthy kissing people, men being in gay bars in Milwaukee, one called the White Horse. I don't think it's there anymore. In the 1950s, kissing a young man when he won the Republican nomination in 1946. I actually tried to look up that guy's son who works at like a shipping company in like Oconomowoc, but he didn't return my calls. But I don't think they're true, to be honest with you. I just think that is, and again, it just tells us that that's the Achilles heel of masculinity in 1954, 55, right? I think that tells us more about American politics and the ubiquity of homophobia than it does necessarily about those men themselves. But I'm only saying that because I can't know for sure, and I have to, I would love to know for sure. Well,
More question.
of course.
Okay, there's a lot of, this is about race and how there might be communists in your neighborhood and you can tell if somebody who's just a regular white person, but they have Black friends that come over, that's how you can tell it's a communist cell. And this is a whole big thing, but that communists would be likely to be friends with white communists with Black people, and
Tá bom, depois a gente fala. Beijo.
That being a whole sort of something that would trigger, aha, they've got a secret.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier about this, the secrecy aspect that united communists and homosexuals in the American imagination. I think that was a bit of it as well. Communists needed to be secretive, homosexuals needed to be secretive. Obviously, un-American people all hang out at the same un-American place, and so they must have certain connections. But one of my favorite things about this queer baiting and Lavender Scare in the 1950s, and this fear that there are all of a sudden more gay people popping up in America somehow in 1946, is that it's actually kind of true. And what I mean by that is that World War II, just in the ways that World War I and World War II upset and caused the Great Migration for Black Americans at the time, it also allowed people to move away from their hometowns, move to major cities for industrial areas, move away from the prying eyes of their parents and their pastor, and maybe experiment with their homosexuality or experiment their sexuality generally. Are there more gay people in 1946 or 1943? No, their sexual preference is probably the same, but they're more visible because they are suddenly in urban areas and feeling comfortable coming out, again, using ahistorical language, but to whatever degree that is possible, because they are thousands of miles away from, whatever small town in Ohio they grew up in. And so when you have these moments where Confidential is saying, oh my gosh, homosexuals are everywhere, they're starting their own club called the Machine Society happening, they're not totally wrong. And what ultimately enables the liberation movement of the mid to late 1960s, and then of course in the 1970s. And so there's this very interesting grand irony there about, in some ways, that being, in an odd way, quote unquote, correct. And so when you have your average American saying, oh my gosh, they're everywhere, there seems to be evidence for Mom and Joe, or Mom and Dad homeowner in Levittown, for what Confidential is saying.
That's what I find most fascinating about tonight's talk, Christopher, is that both in the 20s and the 50s, what I'm starting to kind of glean is that something that seemed hideous, like hideous persecution, was in a way also promotion, PR. That
Right.
It got the word out, that it was reflective of things that were happening, and that were actually in some ways maybe propulsive of things that were to come.
Right. It's wonderful. Yeah, there's an irony about it. It's horrific that it happened to happen that way, but ultimately it fueled connections in a way that were overall positive. Well, this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone, especially Paul and Claude, for organizing. Thank you for the wonderful questions, everybody. I really, really enjoyed it, and for hanging out a little bit with me on your cold Friday night in Minneapolis. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. Thank you for your time and for sharing your information. And everybody should go buy the book, or at least check it out from Quatrefoil. So, thanks.
Open Saturday and Sunday from noon to 5, and we do have Chris's book, although I think right now it might be checked out. We also have the Deviants War in our collection. So noon to 5, Saturday and Sunday. Come check us out and get your cue card. But thank you so much. What a really, really, really interesting talk.